Hello everyone and welcome back to the core of everything, where today we're going to discuss rivers. So most people, when they're doing their GCSEs or when they're in school, they probably learn about meandering rivers and oxbow lakes and stuff like that. But actually rivers are incredibly important for, they provide highways for trade, they provide drinking water, and they are probably the bedrock civilizations like Egypt and the River Nile.
Can I add an extra usage in?
Yeah.
Poo sticks, that cornerstone of society.
Okay, I didn't know what you're talking about then, but yeah, when you're a kid and you drop it over a bridge.
Yeah, sure, when you're a kid or when you're a 20-something-year-old.
Children have an innate fascination with the flow velocity of rivers.
Little do they know.
It starts young.
Yeah. Well, to gain some expertise in rivers, we brought in a PhD student from Imperial College London, Jonah McLeod.
Hello.
Say hi to the folks, Jonah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you both so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. We're very excited to have you.
So am I.
As our second guest. Did you listen to the one with Benusha?
I did. It was fantastic.
I'm glad.
She did great.
Loved
I'm
it.
glad.
Yeah.
Or like and share. Share it to everyone.
Oh, yeah.
Spread the word. So let's kick things off by, if you want to just have a brief introduction of, Jonah, what your expertise is in specifically in your research, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I come from a geology background. I did my geology MSci here at Imperial and stayed on for a PhD focusing on landscape sensitivity to past and future climate change. So thinking about how rivers and landscapes can be affected by changing climates.
Did you always know you wanted to do rivers?
Great question. No, I didn't. I was really into
Did they always
aeolian
flow
geology
towards
for a
you?
while.
Aeolian geology.
Yeah.
Which is...
Well, so this is wind-blown deposits.
Okay.
So sand dune. Basically, I really like dunes, whether they're underwater or sub-aerial. I don't mind.
So you're specifically looking at how rivers change due to climate change, or predicting how rivers might change from climate change?
Well, it's a bit of both. So the first project of my PhD has been about modern rivers, modern ephemeral rivers in Greece. So these are rivers that are dry the vast majority of the time, and thinking about how these really sensitive systems, these really sensitive landscapes, will change in the future and have changed in the recent past as a result of the changing climate. And the sort of way in which the climate is changing is it's a sort of well-established fact at this point that climate change is causing enhanced storminess around the world. The wet places are getting wetter, the dry places are getting wetter, weather extremes are increasing. So in a perennial river like the Amazon or something like that, you know, where it's got water in it all of the time, you add one extra storm in a year due to climate change, and that doesn't change the overall amount of water or sediment that's going through that river a whole bunch. However, if you look at an ephemeral river, one that's actually dry the vast majority of the time, you add one extra storm in that year, and you could double the amount of water and sediment that goes through that river in that year.
And ephemeral rivers themselves, are they, you know, I think ephemeral, I sort of think of deserts that suddenly have these large floods that happen in these desert environments. But do you mean ephemeral in a sense of in urban environments at all, or where are these ephemeral rivers typically found?
Well, you're right that they happen in arid environments, but arid environments are everywhere. So I did fieldwork in Greece, around the Gulf of Corinth, where the rivers are largely ephemeral. They only flood once every 4 or 5 years, right? But some of these ones in deserts won't flood for 50 years or 100 years. So it's a spectrum.
And that's weird because, like, I feel like, you know, when maybe your concept of a river, or like my concept of a river might be like, oh, in my village there's this river that is always there and it's always flowing, and when it rains it fills up a bit. But like, can you give us an idea of like the timescales over which rivers change? Like, are they always there in the same place, or like might they change direction over time?
This is a really good question. Rivers are extremely dynamic, and sometimes it's visible on a sort of human timescale, a short timescale that is understandable by us within our lifetimes. Sometimes it's slower than that. But for example, these ephemeral rivers in Greece, you're right. When you think of a river that might pose a danger to a community, you think of a river that's permanently got loads of water in it and might flood any time. And I think one of the issues is that ephemeral rivers don't pose a very obvious threat because you live there and most of the time there's no water in it. So it's probably fine, right?
Yeah.
Well, it just means that when water does finally come through that river, it's going to be more extreme. In terms of timescales, though, we're talking sort of 100-year, 1,000-year timescales for rivers to migrate laterally, so to move across the surface of the earth in a sort of meandering shape or whatever. You get avulsions that happen every so often. An avulsion is where, rather than slow lateral migration of the course of a river, it'll flood and it will switch sort of instantaneously, talking on geological timescales, to a different course.
Okay. And we'll talk more in a moment about like the different types of rivers and kind of some of these words that we're using. But I have a question for you both. What do you think is the object that is found the most in the bottom of rivers?
Do you know the answer to this?
I don't know the answers, but, you know, I'm interested in the thought experiment.
Are you talking man-made objects?
Yeah, like shopping trolleys is
I'm
kind
going to
of
say
what
like
mine means.
sand or something.
I was going to say sand. That's the easy answer.
It's a good point. I learned the other day, this is going to sound crazy, and this is tangential, and we could edit this out. The Ganges, during the COVID, there were so many people, because obviously the Ganges it's a holy site for a lot of Hindus, I think. And it's a place where people get cremated or buried. Apparently during COVID, the actual Ganges, it swelled up because of the amount of bodies
No way.
that were within the Ganges, or buried on the side of the Ganges.
Wow.
So maybe that's not the most common object at the bottom of a river. I hope not. But it was an article on BBC. Then we can check it out. But
well, I have a competing fact in favour of the shopping trolley. The Telegraph reported that
that's such a switch from like dead people in the Ganges to then the shopping trolley. Go on, sorry.
More than 3,000 shopping trolleys dumped in rivers every year. Apparently,
Dumped in rivers worldwide?
in the UK.
In the UK.
I think, according to British Waterways. I don't quite know how you quantify that. I wonder, is it the fact that you're finding trolleys in rivers, or is it the fact that supermarkets are missing trolleys?
Oh. And if they're missing and they can't be located, they must be in a canal or river.
Must be in a river.
Yeah. Or the middle of a roundabout. I wonder if that makes our rivers swell. Asking the real questions here on the core of everything.
So anyway, one question very briefly is, you say that these things can change direction or shift rapidly laterally. The evidence of those things, are there like scars on the ground that you can see where the river used to be, or is it anything like that? Or how do we know?
Great question. In the sort of recent geologic past, I'm talking in the last 10,000 years or so, we're not likely to see scars, because what will have happened during a big avulsion is...
Remind us what an avulsion is, sorry.
Is where a river has a massive flood,
Okay.
and the path of steepest descent, i.e. the easiest path for that river to take, has now changed.
Okay.
So it can skip hundreds of kilometres
Wow.
laterally.
That's a massive flood. That's huge.
Yeah. So in the recent geologic past, i.e. roughly the last 10,000 years or so, you won't see a scar because it will have flooded and sediment will have infilled that old river channel. But what you can see, and work that I know is currently being done in the Indus Valley, is coring the recent fluvial, the recent river-sourced sediment in the Indus Valley. And you take out a core, and you can see the different layers representing different intervals of fluvial sedimentation that we know happened at the bottom of a river that is no longer there.
Wow.
So
and
you
these
can
cores these are a bit like ice cores, right? Kind of just a column of rock rather than ice.
Exactly. So you drill into it. It might be quite soft still if it was the last the last few thousand years. I mean, the reason that this kind of research is being done is to try and understand what happened to the Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappan civilization, which sort of reached its demise at about 2000 BCE. One of the theories is that it was to do with the changing river processes of the Indus River.
Wow.
So I'm not an expert on geoarchaeology, which is what this is really, which is really cool, by the way, geoarchaeology. I sort of do want to be a geoarchaeologist, but I'm not.
It's a cool title, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like you take geologists and archaeologists and just...
But trying to understand whether that river was to blame, whether there was a big evulsion, whether the flow reduced to the point that it could no longer sustain the Indus Valley civilization. Could have been anything.
It's really cool that like rocks are telling the stories not just of the landscape but of civilizations and communities as well. Yeah,
absolutely. I think in terms of the direction of previous rivers as well, we can use imbrication.
So there's lots of indicators as to where a river has been flowing. So let's say you're looking at fluvial sediment in the rock record. So this is where a river has been in the past. It's deposited a bunch of sediment and it's aggraded, as in the level of the land has gone up as it's deposited that sediment. So all of this sediment is left behind, and you get certain distinctive sedimentary structures that you can see in these outcrops of sandstone or conglomerate or whatever it is, depending on the grain size of the sediment that was at the bed of that river at the time. One of them, as you say, is imbrication. And what this is where you have sort of larger pebbles that are what I would call oblate, so sort of flat, maybe kind of close to a pancake shape.
Minstrel.
A minstrel. Perfect.
Nice.
Yeah.
As these get pushed along the bed of the river, they sort of line up. They sort of recline on top of one another in this very characteristic way.
A bit like Jenga blocks, right? Kind of leaning on each other.
Or when you topple over like dominoes.
Like dominoes, yeah.
Okay,
exactly.
Yeah, better, yeah.
So the sort of more streamlined direction you can use to tell which way that river was flowing.
I think absolutely, and I think obviously that happens in geological. You can see the pebbles or the conglomerates all aligned, but there's also, if you have flooding in urban areas, cars might stack up against each other.
Yeah.
Or shopping trolleys.
Yeah.
Like
the future of imbrication is stacked
preserving the rock record.
Imbricated Nokia phones.
Yeah.
No, I've seen this recently. There's been loads of pictures and videos from loads of floods that have happened in the past few years where you can see, a Fiat stacked up, imbricated against a Ford, and it's like, it's mad.
Wow.
Yeah, that shows just the power of the river, doesn't it? That it can move these cars. It's incredible.
And can you speak into that a little bit? Like, why or how do rivers carry sediment? Like, how do they pick it up? How do they carry it? How do they drop it?
Great question. A big question. It starts in the mountains. And, this is a conversation about source to sink processes. So talking about what happens from the source, i.e. where all of the water and sediment first comes from, where it rains on the top of a hill. That picks up sediment, it gets eroded from the surface of the earth. You get surface runoff, and it all comes and collects into a confined flow of water called a river. That's the source, and you can follow that river all the way down to the sink, which is where that water and sediment ends up. Could be a lake, could be the ocean.
Could be a delta?
Yeah, a delta is a perfect example of where sediment might end up. If you follow a river down to where it meets the sea.
That's a song, isn't it? Where the river meets the sea?
I don't know, but you should write it if it's not.
Yeah, exactly. That sounds lovely. Who sang that?
No idea.
Boyzone?
I
just made that up.
Oh, maybe, yeah.
Good
Westlife.
Yeah. Ronan Keating?
Yeah. We're just flaunting our pop knowledge now.
How many artists can you name?
Yeah, Bass Hunter.
Oh, you like music? Name all the artists.
Oh, dear.
So river meets sea, drops sediment.
Exactly. It's a really characteristic feature of sedimentary systems and surface processes where if you have confined flow of anything and it stops being confined for whatever reason, that flow is going to expand and it's no longer going to be moving as fast. That means it cannot hold the sediment any longer. So this could be a river that enters the sea, or it could be a wind corridor between some mountains on Mars or on Earth. It could be anything, right? Where you have sort of confined flow of air that is suspending some sand grains. When that mountain range ends, the flow is going to expand and they'll get dropped and you'll see a lot of sand dunes there. Yeah.
That's actually lead us on to quite a good place where we can talk about the types of rivers, because as you mentioned, sediment gets deposited in these different areas and that leads to stuff like braided streams where you have these sort of sandbars, that's right, or sand channels, I can't quite remember. But
yeah, totally. So there's loads of different ways, and it's an active field of research trying to figure out how best to classify the shapes of rivers. So this is talking about the plan form of a river. Plan form is basically when you look down from a bird's eye view, what does this river look like? So when you think of a river, the first thing that comes to mind might be a sort of single-threaded river like the Thames or whatever. It's one clearly defined body of water that's flowing downhill. Now that can go from being really straight to being strongly meandering. Meandering means sinuous, it means bendy. So that's sort of one type of classification. So if you're thinking about single channel rivers, they can be straight or they can be meandering. In other settings, for example, often when the slope is steeper, you can end up with a braided river, right? So you have single channel rivers and you have multi-channel rivers. With a steep slope, that might be braided, right? Which just means there's loads of active channels, not just one. These rivers are often shallower. They don't have strong banks. And that means that the rivers can kind of much more easily flow across the floodplain and form new little channels with, as you said, bars in between. A bar is basically a big lump of sediment, bigger than a dune, that's being pushed downstream. And these bars separate these channels. Now you can also have anastomosing or anabranching rivers. And what that means is basically very similar to a braided stream, but instead of these bars moving pretty rapidly downstream, which are just basically covered in gravel or sand or whatever it is, these bars are actually much more stable and they start to become vegetated.
Okay.
So it means plants and trees can grow on these bars.
And that consolidates the sediment as well, right?
Exactly. Yeah, plants definitely do have a really strong capability to, as you say, consolidate sediment, strengthen the banks of rivers, and actually really significantly change river geomorphology.
And I think a really good place, or at least that I've seen these multi-channel rivers, is kind of the runoff from glaciers, kind of onto, like in Iceland, for example, the floodplains that you have, it's just all these different channels. And maybe that's because your source of water is a very like wide front of the glacier. And you get all these like kind of, I don't know if they'd be braided or the anabranching, but...
Well, the first things that come to mind with that is if you're in a glacial or periglacial zone, you might be quite high up, meaning that the slope might be quite high.
Right, okay.
Meaning that you're more likely to develop a braided river. The other thing is kind of actually exactly what I was just saying with going from confined flow to non-confined flow. Sometimes you can have a subglacial river where the ice in the glacier melts, flows to the bottom where the glacier meets the bedrock, and it becomes confined in a channel in sediment and also in a sort of cavern that is sort of carved out into the base of that glacier, and it's confined. You get really, really high velocity flow downhill, downslope, and the minute it exits that glacier, it drops all of its sediment. And you get these weird proglacial features like eskers, which are these big mounds of sediment that happen in front of a glacier when when this subglacial river comes out and drops all its sediment.
There's also subterranean rivers, which I don't know much about really, but I found one that's called the Puerto Princesa underground river in the Philippines, and it flows for about 5 miles underneath a mountain and it empties into the South China Sea. So it's not just that we can see them on a bird's eye view, but actually there's thousands, if hundreds of thousands of rivers that we can't see under mountains. And also I think the London's famous for having the Thames or the other rivers that are flowing beneath our feet.
Yeah, I know next to nothing about this, but people have told me that there's loads of unseen rivers underneath London because
Really?
the Thames has many tributaries that have been paved over. So sometimes you'll be walking down a road in the city of London or whatever, and you look through a grate and you can see a river, and it's not the Thames, it's a tributary of the Thames.
Oh, so it's not just like a sewage channel, it is an actual...
that a street has been built on top of.
Wow.
I was actually at a conference the other day, a geochemistry conference. It was my first conference I had to give a presentation at.
Oh, wow.
And I found
Congrats.
that... Thank you. Yeah, well, it went well.
Oh, good. Congrats.
Yeah. And I was amazed and also confused to see that maybe 50% of the talks were all about the River Wandle in London, which is in the southwest, and how the River Wandle itself is tributary to the Thames, like you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It's full of cocaine.
What?
It's absolutely full of cocaine. People kept on talking about cocaine on the River Wandle. I think it's to do with the fact that there's a hospital upstream.
Right.
So obviously, and there's apparently hospitals dump cocaine into the river. I don't know.
So when you were asking earlier, what do you think is the most common object that you find at the beds of a river, was the correct answer cocaine?
Yeah, people getting trolleyed. All right.
Very
good. But yeah, no, exactly. So it's a segue into what it's not really what we're talking about, but it's found it fascinating that there's just so much cocaine, particularly in southwest London, although not massively surprising.
Well, it's weird. It's just another kind of pollutant, isn't it?
Yeah.
One other thing that's in a river that isn't supposed to be in a river. This is a huge issue that is, again, a really active area of research, is trying to quantify and predict pollutants, where they come from, where they end up, how that affects the landscape, how that affects biodiversity in rivers.
That's right. I mean, I think there are mechanisms in which you can place sort of filters that detect certain levels of iron concentrations or whatever, sulfur concentrations and everything like that, and then scientists can take that away and then measure the concentrations of different aspects within a river, and then you can correlate that with the location of which it's taken along the river and say, oh, there's a source of toxic waste coming from this position, because we know above this, upstream from that position, we don't see it. Hi everyone, that's the end of part 1 of our conversation with Jonah, all about rivers. We were going to try and make it all in 20 minutes, but actually Jonah was so interesting we thought we'd make it a 2-parter. So that's the end of part 1, and join us again for part 2.